Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. Today I'm going to be making some really nice looking cutting boards, and I'm going to show you how to make these even if you don't have a shop full of tools and equipment. I've made a lot of cutting boards over the years, and I'm going to be sharing a lot of tips and tricks along the way that are going to save you time and money. So come on, let's get started. I'm going to be using maple, cherry, and walnut for these cutting boards. I would avoid any soft woods such as pine, cedar, cypress, fir. These woods are just too soft to be used in cutting boards, and they can also leave a nasty flavor behind. I'll leave a list below of the woods that I like to use in my cutting boards. Now, a joiner and a planer are pretty essential tools to have in a wood shop to be able to flatten and square rough sawn lumber. However, if you don't have these tools yet, you can still build these cutting boards by asking your hardwood dealer for pre-surfaced lumber. Now, this is just lumber that's been flattened and surfaced on at least two sides and one edge. It's typically referred to as either S4S, which means surfaced four sides, or S3S for surfaced three sides. Now, getting your materials pre-surfaced like this is going to be a little bit more expensive, but if you don't have the tools that you need to mill rough lumber, then this is really your best option. Now, there's one more thing to think about when it comes to materials. That's how wide of a board do you want to get. Now, I want my cutting boards to be about 12 inches wide. However, if I buy my lumber 12 inches wide, I'm going to pay a premium on that board. That can be as much as 1.5 to 2 times as much as a narrower board. I'm sticking with stock that is about 6 to 7 inches wide, and I'm going to glue them together to get the wider panel that I need. Doing this is going to create an additional glue joint in the board. However, it's going to save you a lot more money in the long run. So first I need to cut each of these boards down. I'm making them 3 foot long by 6 inches wide. Then I'll take one each of the walnut, maple, and cherry over to the table saw to cut some thin decorative strips. I prefer to cut thin strips on the opposite side of the blade from the fence. This is because thin strips can vibrate between the blade and the fence and cause burning and saw marks on the wood. Now here I'm using a thin strip jig from Rockler to get the exact same size thin strip every time. Now, while this jig is certainly nice to have in the shop, it's not the only method that you can use to cut thin strips. In fact, let me show you another method that doesn't require any additional tools or jigs at all. Now with this method, we're still cutting on the opposite side of the blade from the fence. Just take a previously cut thin strip and set it up against the blade. Now take your workpiece and adjust the fence over until those pieces are flush with each other. Then lock down your fence. Now you can move the other thin strip out of the way, turn on the saw, and make your cut. Now this method can be just as accurate, but it does take a little bit longer to set up than it is using the jig. Now after cutting all the thin strips, I also ripped an 1.5 inch piece off of each of the boards. This is where we will sandwich in these thin strips. With all of our pieces cut, now it's time to prepare for our glue up. But first we want to make sure that we get some of each type of wood with each board. So our cherry is going to get some strips of maple and walnut. Our walnut board is going to get some strips of cherry and maple. And of course our maple board is going to get some cherry and walnut strips. Now when it comes to glue for these cutting boards, you want to make sure you're using a water resistant glue. I like to use Titebond 2. There are a few other options that you can choose out there, but this is the one that I've been using for many years and I've always had great results. To ensure we have a strong glue joint, you want to have an even layer of glue. Don't leave any dry spots. You can use a brush or roller or just your finger to spread the glue evenly over the entire glue joint. Now for me, I prefer to use this rubber ink roller. I just haven't found anything that works as quickly or as efficiently as this. Now you want to start tightening the clamps slowly and evenly. Do a little at a time on each clamp. I also like to use a piece of scrap to hold the boards down tight against the clamp rails. This helps to ensure everything stays in alignment and the boards don't slip and slide past each other. Now you don't have to go all gorilla mode on these clamps. Just tighten them enough to close up the joint. Too much pressure can squeeze out the glue and that's going to cause a weak joint. There are a couple of options for dealing with the glue squeeze out. I like to wait 30 to 40 minutes for the glue to start to set up and gets a little film over the top. I can then use a paint scraper to remove the majority of the glue without leaving behind a big mess. Now you want the boards to set in the clamps for at least a couple of hours. It certainly doesn't hurt to go longer. I think I actually went about 3 days before I finally got around to coming back to these. All right, now that we've got our boards out of the clamps, it's time to do a little bit of cleanup. Now, even though we wiped off the majority of the glue, we've still got some squeeze out we got to deal with. Also, no matter how careful you were with your glue up and making sure everything was properly aligned, there's still going to be a little bit of inconsistencies between your glue joints where one board is going to be higher than the other. So before we cut these down into individual boards, we need to do some rough cleanup, and we've got a couple of options for that. First, if you do have a planer, this is the perfect time that you want to use it. It'll just take a couple of real quick passes on each side to clean these up, and then we're ready to move on to the next step. However, if you don't have that planer, our second option is sanding. So hopefully you have a random orbit sander. I recommend going with 80 grit and just sticking with 80 grit until you've cleaned up all of the glue squeeze out and these boards are perfectly smooth. We're not looking for a finish ready surface. We just want to clean up the glue squeeze out and any inconsistencies in the glue up. So a couple of quick tips on sanding with a random orbit sander. One, don't tilt the sander over on its edge to try to knock down high spots. This is going to leave gouges in the wood, and it can also overstress the motor on your sander and cause it to wear out faster. The same applies for putting too much pressure on the sander to try to get it to sand faster. This is going to overstress the motor and can cause your sander to fail early. You just want light pressure on top of the sander, just enough to keep it moving where you want it to go. You don't really need anything more than the weight of your hand and the weight of the sander. Just let the sander and the sandpaper do its job. Now it's time to cut these panels down into individual cutting boards, and to do that I'm going to use my ridiculously oversized crosscut sled. Seriously, you don't need anything near this big. You could just use your table saw's miter gauge, or if you have a miter saw, you can use it to cut these down. Whatever you use, you just want to make sure that you're getting good square cuts. Each of my cutting boards are going to be 9 inches by 12 inches. From the original 6-foot long boards, I'm getting 12 cutting boards with very little waste. We have all of our boards cut out, so now it's time to do something about the sharp edges because no one wants to cut themselves on their cutting board. So I recommend either going with a chamfer or a small roundover on the edges. Now on these small boards, I prefer a roundover, and you don't want to go too large with the roundover. A 1/2 inch or even a 1/4 inch roundover is probably not going to look real good on a board this size. So I'm actually going to go with a 1/8 inch roundover. And depending on what tools you have, there's a couple of different options for doing your edge profile. The fastest and the easiest is probably going to be using a router table. Just a quick setup and you can run through all of these boards in a matter of minutes. Another option would be to use a handheld trim router and the bit of your choice. Trim routers are great for adding edge profiles, especially if you're using smaller router bits. You just need to make sure that you keep the router flat so you don't gouge into your work. And finally, if you don't have a router table or even a palm router, you can just use a sanding block or even a block of wood with just sandpaper wrapped around it to create chamfers or roundovers. So we've got the edge profiles taken care of, but these boards are still pretty rough. So we need to go through our sanding process. Now my strategy for this is I'm going to take my pencil and scribble all over each side of the boards and work my way through my sanding grit. So I'm going to start with 120 grit. Go through that one, then we'll work up to 150, 180, and then finally 220 grit. Marking the boards each time with a pencil in between so I know when I'm done with that grit and I can move on to the next one. And just like before, we're going to use light, even pressure while we're sanding. Don't tip the sander over on its edge, that's going to leave gouges. Just try to be patient and let the sander and the sandpaper do its work. Now with all of our sanding done, these boards feel really nice and smooth. However, they won't stay that way if we stop here. You see, the first time someone goes to rinse the board off, the wood is going to absorb some of that moisture, and it's going to cause all the little broken fibers of wood to stand on end, and it's going to make the board very rough and kind of fuzzy feeling. So to prevent this, we're going to use a technique called water popping. Now this is really simple. All we do is take a spray bottle of water and spray over our cutting boards. You let them dry and this will cause the grain to pre-raise. After the boards have dried, we come back with our 220 grit sandpaper and give them a light sanding. Now this will prevent the grain from rising again in the future. Alright, so now it's time to start finishing these boards, and really this is the fun part for me because this is where we see the wood really come to life once that oil hits the wood. Now I've got a tub here with some mineral oil in it. Notice I said mineral oil, not mineral spirits. Those are two very different things. Now I'm not going to soak the boards in this mineral oil. I'm just going to dip and move them over to a drying rack and let them dry. With these long grain boards, there's really no reason to soak them for a long time. They're not going to absorb that much of the oil. So just a quick dip and we'll let them dry out. All right, so the last thing we need to do to these boards is add a cutting board conditioner to give these a little bit of moisture protection in the kitchen. Now I'm using a board butter that I make myself. This is really just a mixture of mineral oil and beeswax. Now there's quite a few products you can buy for this. They're commonly sold as either a board butter or butcher block conditioner. They're all basically just a mixture of mineral oil and beeswax, and it's actually really easy to make your own if you want to. And this is really easy to apply. You just put some on a rag and rub it into the board and buff it until you get a nice sheen. This should be redone every few weeks or whenever the board starts to look a little bit dull. These cutting boards make awesome gifts and they're really great to have around the kitchen. If you guys have any other tips you'd like to share, please leave those in the comments below. Of course, if you have any questions, let me know as well. I'll try to answer as many as I can from you all. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave me a thumbs up and subscribe for more woodworking videos. Speaking of videos, I have a few over here that I think you'll like. Thanks for stopping by.